Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session of the World Buiatrics Congress here in Dublin on small ruminants. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker, who is Professor Neil Sargison. Neil holds the chair in farm animal practice at the University of Edinburgh, and we've been friends for a long time. He has over 30 years experience in farm animal practice. He completed his PhD on the genomics of Helminth contortus, and while still in first opinion practice, was the first person in the UK to report triple resistance in parasite strains. Over the last 5 years, he's developed a project in India, and this informs him on the talk he's about to present to us, which is entitled Small Ruminants, Opportunities for Improved Production Efficiency to Sustainably Meet the Needs of the world's human population for food. So, thank you very much, Neil, and we look forward to your presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Phil. Is the microphone working?
Yeah.
Thank you. So, small ruminants have a really important role to play integrated into global agriculture. They're not only important in commercial agricultural systems, but also to the likes of this family here in central India, who depend on the sheep that you can see in the background for their living and their livelihood. Goats are particularly important because they're evolved to be able to convert very poor quality nutrients into food, and they feed by browsing in doing so. And so goats are well suited to grazing in areas where the resources can't be utilised by other species, and therefore have an important role in the alleviation of poverty and in food security. Sheep are important because of their efficiency of converting short herbage into nutrients, and sheep have a particular role to play in arid environments, again in the alleviation of poverty and also in sustainable global agriculture. And the man holding the lamb in this image is a villager in southern India. And the reason I was introduced to this person was because it was sheep that had allowed him to build a house and to move out of the mud hut that he'd been in prior to that. And it was sheep that had actually allowed him to educate his daughters, showing the important role that these animals have to play. We need to be aware of the need for more efficient nutrient production from livestock in order to meet the needs of the world's growing population, already exceeding 7 billion people. The image on the right is taken in a very small town in rural southern India and just shows that sort of population density, and it's sobering to look at that image and to consider the fact that all of these people need to be fed. And the image on the left is actually taken in one of the most exclusive regions of Mumbai, and you can see there as well that the population density is so dense that it's spilling over onto the beach, and in fact we can also see the people's pigs actually on the beach feeding on the sewage outflow that's coming from the posh district of Mumbai. Small ruminants are arguably the most adaptable livestock to be able to meet these global needs for food security in the face of population growth, urbanization, and also, as we can see in the image of Mumbai, increased affluence and an increased requirement for meat. When we talk about improved production efficiency, we need to do so in a way that bears in mind that global resources need to be utilized and food produced in a manner that minimises the environmental footprints, that meets high standards of animal welfare, and is socially acceptable. And in actually addressing these needs, we need to realise and understand the effects of population growth itself and the impact that that has on livestock production. We need to understand the demands of urbanization and affluence and the type of livestock product that then is required to feed these people. We need to understand the consequences of climate change, and we need to understand and appreciate that to date our use of drugs and chemicals in livestock production has generally been irresponsible. And the image at the top shows groundwater irrigation to produce crops, which are to feed these animals that you can see in the foreground. And unless that animal production is highly efficient, that is not a sustainable scenario. The image at the bottom is of a dead Asian vulture, and we all know about the consequences of unsustainable use of diclofenac as a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug in cattle, and the impact that that has then had on the apex predators, and how the Asian vulture was almost annihilated as a result of indiscriminate and poorly thought out use of non-steroidals in cattle. So small ruminant farming is often portrayed as being the solution to sustainable global food security and to poverty alleviation. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Small ruminants have got a manageable size, and we can see all these reasons in the image here. They have relatively low maintenance requirements per unit of food that they actually produce, and they definitely have much lower maintenance requirements than cattle or buffalo in that regard. They generally have low capital investment costs, short generation intervals, and there are generally ease of marketing for them. So these animals that we can see in this image here can be taken to the slaughter slab that we see here. They can be slaughtered, they can be marketed locally. That fits the system. And importantly, in many developing countries, those small ruminants act as short-term economic reserves, and they're referred to as the automatic teller machines of these regions. And actually, 40 years ago nearly now, I started my own flock of sheep. I no longer have my own flock of sheep, but the very reasons that I became interested in sheep and started my own flock of sheep are the same reasons as we can see here for why sheep and goats are so important globally. So that importance of small ruminants globally is well recognized. And in parts of the world, in this example in Tamil Nadu in southern India, there are schemes to empower people to keep small ruminants. And this particular scheme is referred to as the 4-goat scheme, and to date has distributed about 2 million goats to women in poor rural parts of Tamil Nadu. The women get given 3 female and 1 male goats. It's the veterinary profession that are responsible for the procurement of those animals and for running the camps that are needed to actually then distribute those animals from. And there's an obligation on the veterinary profession then to provide special treatment camps for these animals, and also mobile teams to come to people's help by giving advice on the end of a telephone. And then this is all in this cutting from a newspaper in 2011. We need to ask ourselves if these sorts of schemes are efficient, welfare-friendly, economically or environmentally sustainable. And I certainly have my opinions on that. The truth is that small ruminant farming is no different from cattle farming or buffalo farming in that it is inherently inefficient and actually it's unsustainable. And that situation applies both to lower middle income countries and also to developed economies, developed agricultural economies around the world. This image actually is a vet school in Kerala in southern India, and it's a statue of a tribal lady, and here she is holding a goat, and it's just meant to depict the importance of these small ruminants to poor people in these parts of the world. So as a result of that inefficiency of small ruminant production, wherever we are around the world, these sheep here in the top image are actually our vet school's sheep, and this is me with my dog just having a look at these sheep. Sheep production or small ruminant production is uneconomic. It's not conducive to good states of animal welfare. By and large, best animal welfare is achieved in the most efficient production systems. The fact that inefficient production systems means that we've got to keep these animals alive for longer before we can actually slaughter them, means that their nutrient requirements for maintenance are larger, so they produce relatively higher levels of greenhouse gas emissions when compared to efficiently produced animals. And we also need to concern ourselves with the ecological impact of these animals that are kept in this inefficient way. Wherever you go around the world, and this picture here shows a sign in a vet school in Madhya Pradesh in central India, people will tell you that the solution to that inefficiency in small ruminant production lies in genetic improvement. They'll also add technological advance and nutritional management, but animal health management tends to get left off the bottom of the list. I have no doubt that genetic improvement, when undertaken in conjunction with having automated data recording systems and better reproductive management tools, will prove to be essential in meeting the needs of the world's population for food. And we're already seeing schemes which involve breed replacement, breed crossing heterosis, selection from within breeding, and we're even now seeing schemes aimed at gene editing to actually edit in or out genes that actually confer traits that are seen as being desirable. I'm not convinced that this is the immediate solution to what we actually need. I'm not convinced that breeding animals like these Jamnapuri goats, for example, is the solution to feeding the world. I think that before we're ready to actually adopt these technologies, we have to be able to keep these animals alive and productive, and I think that the key to keeping these animals alive and productive is to apply a rigorous scientific approach to health planning and health management. Genetic improvement has actually had a huge impact in the pig and poultry industries. And the reason for that is that it's been able to have been matched by appropriate nutrition and animal health management. The problem with most small ruminant production, perhaps the exception being this commercial goat production that we can see in the image on the right, where things are well regulated, the feed is taken to them, there's a lot of automation in terms of what's going on. But in general, the problem with commercial small ruminant production, where the aim of those animals is to convert natural resources into food, is that we can't manage them precisely, and so it's very, very difficult then to capitalize on and to develop those genetic improvement resources. So I see the solution to these problems as being animal health management. I see this as offering an opportunity for improved small ruminant production efficiency to meet the needs of the world's population for food, whether that is in the poorest areas of the world or in advanced agricultural economies, as shown there. I don't pretend that before we can actually have any impact through planned animal health, that it's necessary to create equitable markets, supply chains, and finances in many parts of the world, but that's something that's achievable. So when planning animal health, we need to remember why people are keeping sheep and goats. And people keep sheep and goats in order to convert primary forage, natural herbage, or cereal crops into a marketable product. So the resource that these people in these images actually have is not the animals, they're the tools to convert the resource into something that can be sold. The resource is the crops that those animals are actually feeding on. And the profitability and sustainability and profitability go hand in hand of global livestock production is influenced by the efficiency with which these animals convert meat, wool, milk, etc. into something that can be sold. Now this lady in the image at the top right is in her 70s. And she's the last in her family that's likely to be farming sheep. They have a flock of about 150 sheep, and they depend on taking those sheep to free grazing, which is what these animals are on. It's actually a golf course that they're grazing on at the moment. But they take these animals to free grazing every day. The animals graze on there. They produce the lambs are sold, etc. Her sons and her grandchildren are all in information technology. There is no way that they're going to spend their lives actually tending groups of sheep for the whole day. That's just not sustainable. And there are similar constraints to the chap in the Falkland Islands in the picture below. So we actually, in order to achieve anything, we need to have a completely fresh perspective on the way in which these animals are managed. We need to have a fresh perspective on what are reasonable targets and what the concept of disease control is. And part of that needs to also include a focus on responsible use of medicines rather than simple dependence on blueprint use of pharmaceutical treatments. And that's a global issue wherever we are around the world. There are lots of resources and sources of information available from which we can build our health plans. We've got the internet, we've got textbooks, we've got colleagues, we've got conferences, we've got all of these sorts of things that we can depend on. But we need to ask ourselves, are these resources what's needed to help the people in this image, for example, or to help agri-businesses? And I'm not convinced they are. I think that the approach to health planning is to actually apply scientific principles, where the first thing that we need to be able to do is to go onto these farms, wherever they are in the world. These images are taken in all corners of the world, in the UK, in China, and in New Zealand. Wherever these animals are in the world, we need to be able to look at them, and the first question we have to ask is, are they performing according to reasonable targets for those animals in the environment and with the management system that they have? If they're not, which invariably they're not, we need to identify the constraints, and we need to do that by rationally investigating any animal health problem. The next step is that we have to ensure that we use the most appropriate remedies or management efficiently and based on the assessment of the individual circumstances. Because just as these production systems for sheep that we can see in the images around the world are very different, so are production systems on neighbouring farms in similar parts of the world very different as well. Having done that, the next step is to evaluate the response and the cost benefits of what we've done. And invariably, there will be room for improvement, so we need to monitor to ensure satisfactory productivity. And when we still haven't achieved that satisfactory productivity, we go back to the start and we repeat the process. And that's the process of planned animal health management. So I want to give an example as proof of concept. And this example refers to a student project that we had working with a commercial herd of Malabari goats in Kerala in southern India. Now, these are goats that have been genetically improved to produce lots of kids and to produce kids with fast growth rates. And they have actually become the mainstay of commercial goat production in southern India. They're derived from crosses between Boer goats and other local breeds, and they're bred for prolificacy and meat production. There are elements of the management of this particular herd which are representative across the whole region, and then there are elements of the management which are unique, as is always the case to this particular herd. When we start to ask about animal health management in this herd, we get standard responses, and there's a tendency for the keepers of these animals to focus on visually obvious issues. So Menesia tapeworms become important, and they focus animal health management on those Menesia tapeworms simply because they can see the segments in the feces. Haemonchus becomes important because the dogma is that in all subtropical regions, Haemonchus is, and the dogma is correct, by the way, Haemonchus is the main constraint to production. But that's not helpful because it doesn't actually allow for an objective approach to the control of things. And the consequence of this non-objective approach is that they depend on ad hoc treatments using fenbendazole and praziquantel to try and combine treatment of the two parasites that they see. And we need to ask the question, is it effective or sustainable? So the first part of the health planning process is, are these animals performing to targets? And through having a student working with them for a month, we managed to get what the production data for these animals was. That's not always easy. And we realized that these animals are rearing 1 kid per doe per year. The 4-week-old kid weight is 4 kilos. The adult doe weight for the breed, it's meant to be about 30 to 32 kilos, 27 kilos in this situation. The yearling weight, and this was a mean weight at 15 months age, was just 11.1 kilos. They were kidding all year round, and the mean age of the adult does was around about 3 years, and that became obvious that the reason for that was that there was a high involuntary culling rate due to failure to rebreed. Now, we can all look at those figures, and they are so far off the mark. They're so far off what the breed has been selected to be able to do. It's not sustainable. It's not economic. In fact, the size of this herd has been diminishing over the years just because they simply can't sustain the herd, let alone make any money from the herd. This is not efficient small ruminant production. So having identified the primary problems, in particular being in terms of nutrition, which we can see through the growth rates of these animals, and also problems in terms of reproductive performance, and they're linked. The next step is actually to rationally investigate the primary animal health problems that are there. Just before talking about that, I want to talk about this another production system, also in southern India. This is a transhumance production system, and these images are taken from a flock of 900 ewes. These are large commercial flocks that they keep in these transhumance systems, and it's a common production system in that part of the world. What happens is that these animals go from one place to another. Every night they move on and they're kept somewhere different, and they work their way through different states in southern India. These ones had started in Karnataka. These pictures are taken in Tamil Nadu, and they were working their way down into Kerala. And on the way, they utilize free grazing, or they actually utilize byproducts, aftermaths, etc. So on the way down to Kerala, by the time they reach Kerala, the rice has been harvested, and they then go onto the rice paddies. Generally, farmers pay them to actually fold their animals on their ground overnight, and they pay them because these animals are a source of manure to those farmers. The value of sheep meat is extremely high in this part of the world, and it's a system that on the surface of it looks really good. It's a system that's open to lots of challenges, and the bottom image, I think, shows almost all of those challenges in one image. Urbanization is a huge problem, and when people build these factories, such as this Bosch factory here, which has just appeared out of nowhere, just in the middle of where these animals are, instead of it taking 1 day to get from one source of water to another, which is what they have to be able to do, it takes 2 days, and they can't keep going that way, and so this is a real threat to a way of life. The other challenge that we can see in this image is that on the day that I visited these animals, there were an awful lot of sick animals. And those sick animals were pyrexic, and they had obvious respiratory disease. And here they were treating them with enrofloxacin and oxytetracycline and giving them some non-steroidals as well. They can just walk into a shop anywhere and they can get those drugs, and they can treat those animals with those drugs. They have no idea what's wrong with those animals. And it highlights to me the fact that we desperately need diagnostic tools in order to be able to answer those questions as to what's wrong with these animals. This system that we've got with these transhumance animals is a biosecurity nightmare. They're crossing paths with animals that are kept in one place all the time. It's a fantastic way of spreading disease. In all probability, but we don't know, this is actually PPR that these animals actually have. PPR has been flagged up as a disease that we should be looking to control, even eradicate globally, following on from rinderpest eradication. How on earth are we supposed to be able to do that when we don't even know what animals are infected with the disease in the first place? It's just an example of the fact that in order to take this health planning approach forward, we really do need ease of use diagnostic tests that we can use to inform the management of this herd, to inform local strategies, and to inform national disease control. So moving back to the Malabari goat herd, where do we start? We need to start by investigating the linked causes of poor reproductive performance and kid growth rates. It's not practical to try and solve everything at once, so we need to pick things off, and the way to do things is to pick off the bigger issues first. We looked a little bit into the nutritional problems. These animals get fed on jackfruit leaves throughout much of the year. When there's no jackfruit leaves, they get fed on napier grass. During the times of the year when it's dry, the animals get taken out to feed on free grazing. During the times of the year when it's wet, the animals get kept in these glorious housing conditions here, and the food gets brought to them. Actually, they were already aware of the fact that the animals weren't performing, and they were trying to compensate for that, as is commonplace, by feeding grain in addition to that. And they were feeding rather a lot of grain to these animals, and I suspect that by feeding grain to these animals, they were creating a situation where they had subclinical ruminal acidosis, and in fact it was destroying the whole system because it was destroying the efficiency with which these animals could actually digest these natural resources that they're there to convert into something that can be sold in the first place. We had a look at the serum protein concentrations of some of these animals. We looked at different animals, whether they were pregnant, lactating, yearling animals, etc. And in every case, and this was in August, just at the beginning of the wet season, in every case, those animals had profoundly low albumin levels and more or less normal globulin levels. And to me, that's an indication of the fact that the primary problem here is in the rumen-degradable protein nutrition of these animals, as opposed to infectious disease problem or a protein loss problem from these animals. We also looked at gastrointestinal parasites. These are claimed to be the biggest problem in these groups of animals. And the beauty of looking at Helminth parasites is that we have diagnostic tools that we can actually use to look at them, and it gives us that sort of door into health planning that we so need for many other diseases. We looked at the worm egg counts of these animals, and they're a little bit varied and a little bit mixed, and the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, how do we interpret these egg counts that we've got, and how do they help to inform animal health management? Now, I'm not here this morning to talk about worms and how we interpret these, but we do need to interpret these counts with the knowledge that this is just the beginning of the wet season. And actually, we wouldn't expect the Haemonchus counts to be coming up for another few weeks until we're just right into the wet season. To be getting these counts at the stage that we're getting them at, they are significant. There's no question about that, but there's a lot more work needed to look into that. So the next part of the health planning process is to put in place remedies that we feel are the most appropriate remedies. And when it comes to the nutritional problem, the remedies are not simply to feed them more grain or to try too hard to create a balanced ration, because the economics of that become unsustainable. The remedies are actually to look at the way in which these animals are managed. And in this case, they're currently kidding all year round. If we change the kidding management to an annual kidding pattern with a compact kidding season, we can actually have these animals so that their times of year when their peak requirements for protein and energy are correspond with the availability of natural resources, and the times of year when their requirements are lower actually correspond with periods of drought or periods of extreme rain when they can't actually utilize those natural resources. The other thing that we need to look into, clearly based on those egg counts that we've got, is to actually identifying sustainable Helminth control. Next step is to evaluate the responses to what we put in place. In the case of nutritional management, if we go for a compact kidding program, we've actually got to then follow up, and we've got to show the benefits of that, and we've got to refine it because we won't get it right straight away. In terms of the parasites, an example of how we evaluate the responses is it's always worth having a look at the efficacy of the drugs that we're actually using. We looked at the efficacy of fenbendazole, which was the drug that was being used on this farm, and we showed that we had a 75% reduction in egg counts. Actually, we also looked at the differential species reduction. Haemonchus was only about 50% of the species that were there. It was Haemonchus that the resistance that was in at the time. That represents a fairly serious problem. Actually, the identification of resistance in the goats in this case is not just important when it comes to the goats in this particular area. These animals get taken out to free grazing, and they cross paths in that free grazing with the cattle and things like this. And this is the area that they were actually going on to. Haemonchus, which is the parasite in which the worms are resistant, is equally a parasite of cattle in these areas. Here we've got the opportunity through our irrational use of anthelmintics in the goats to actually create problems that affect all of the livestock species that are present in the area. So the next step is to inform more effective management, to better understand the constraints, and to demonstrate the performance against the original indices. And this is where health planning becomes a cyclical sort of process, giving the opportunity for further improvement, giving the potential to better utilize natural resources. And this is where the scope for genetics and new technologies actually comes in. It's not until we've got to this stage that we can actually start to apply those things. So around the world, the opportunities for engagement with planned small ruminant management are the same. This picture's in Scotland, and the opportunities are exactly the same in the sheep in this image here as they are in those Malabari goats in southern India. We have lots of opportunities to be involved with nutritional management. We have lots of opportunities to be involved with infectious disease control, but wherever we are, our biggest constraints are in the availability of diagnostics to allow us to actually do that work. And we have definite opportunities for involvement with parasitology. And parasitology is really important here because in general, parasites, or the parasites that are production-limiting parasites here, are particularly amenable to simple diagnostic procedures. Things like just taking a piece of sellotape to the skin of these animals and looking at the arthropod parasites that they've got and identifying what they are. Things like worm egg counts, which is a dead simple procedure that every veterinary practice around the world should be doing for themselves. And also things like looking at blood smears for many of the vector-borne protozoal parasites, or protozoal and filarial parasites. We also have access to abattoir information for parasitology, or in the African context I showed earlier, to slaughter slab information, and that information gives us a fantastic opportunity to become established with parasite control as part of health planning. Parasites are really important when it comes to small ruminant or all ruminant health. Most of the parasites that we're interested in alternate their life cycles between free living stages and stages in the host. And those free living stages are particularly driven by, or the populations are particularly driven by climatic and environmental conditions, whereas the stages in the host are influenced by host immunity, host nutritional status, other disease status in the host, etc. And put these factors together, we create an ideal environment for the things like protozoal parasites, such as Eimeria, to establish high infectious burdens where we've got intensive management in unhygienic conditions and wet conditions as well. We can have opportunities in certain climates for arthropod parasites to become important, and we create specific opportunities for Helminth parasites. And in this part of the world, the Helminth parasites are beyond question the most important production-limiting diseases that affect small ruminants, both the roundworm parasites and, in this part of the world, the fluke parasites, fasciola in particular. So I believe that getting involved with Helminth parasite management is one of the foremost opportunities for improved small ruminant production. And I believe that that not only has an impact in terms of livestock production, which I've just described, but it also has public health impacts. Actually, in the list of neglected tropical diseases, parasites are way up there in terms of being important in people. And you just need to look at these images here, for example, see the children in the bare feet, and just straight away we can start worrying about cutaneous larval migrans associated with hookworm parasites, for example. How do we control parasites? Here's an example of a roundworm problem, high worm egg counts in sheep that are grazed in Scotland, but the situation could be replicated anywhere around the world. And we have to ask ourselves, how would we manage this immediate problem? We all know that simply treating these animals with anthelmintic drugs doesn't work. And in fact, when we consider how we manage these animals, we've got to look to the life cycles of the parasites, we've got to understand the effects of the parasite on the host, and then we've got to come up with control programs which have got the aim of limiting host challenge to a level that doesn't compromise performance or welfare, while at the same time allowing the development of immunity. And we can only come up with sustainable control programs for individual flocks or herds that are based on common sense application of knowledge of the farming system, of the relationship between pasture contamination, the availability of infective larvae on pasture, and the build-up of infection in animals. And that's a global principle. So this farmer here has to look at the disease risk based on the known epidemiology. And the reality is that around the world, most farmers find this extremely complicated and resort to the use of anthelmintic drugs and depend on the use of anthelmintic drugs for parasite control. And we have to ask ourselves, is that sustainable? These Helminth parasites that we're dealing with have got very large genomes with very large numbers of genes, and within the populations there are very, very large numbers of levels of polymorphism. These parasites are inevitably going to evolve in response to both favourable conditions that are given to them, for example, afforded by climate change, or unfavourable conditions which may be, for example, produced by exposure to anthelmintic drugs. And so it's inevitable that these parasites are going to evolve not just anthelmintic resistance, but they're going to evolve means of actually evading whatever control we put in place. And in particular, when we depend on control using drugs, it's inevitably unsustainable, and we're going to run into resistance problems. And we already have high levels of resistance in a number of Helminth parasites, and we need to look at management to actually control those. So I'm aware of my time running out, so I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but These prescriptive control measures that we depend on in European small ruminant production and are also being propagated as the solution to small ruminant production around the world simply don't work and are unsustainable. And we have to look at sustainable control, and we have a number of recommendations aimed at reducing the selection of resistance. Oops. In the absence of contradictory research findings, these recommendations are pragmatic. But it's really difficult to get these complex recommendations across to the people who actually need to be adhering to them. Here we've got these nomadic shepherds in southern India, without having a good evidence base for what they're actually based on. We now have really good annotated genomes for two Helminth parasites, for Haemonchus contortus and for Fasciola hepatica. And these genomes are actually a fantastic resource on which we can actually improve our understanding of the genomic or the population genomics of phenotypic traits that actually confer an advantage to the parasites. And so we now have also got increased efficiency of the platforms that we can use for doing things like very long read sequencing or even whole genome sequencing. And at the same time as that, the cost of these technologies has come way down. I don't think that there's been a time up to now that has been as ideal for us to be able to address those challenges of sustainable small ruminant production as there is today. With these high-level scientific platforms that we've got, when we can combine them with our understanding of animal management and animal disease in the field, and then also combine that with impactful education, we actually have a real opportunity to make a difference. So I'm going to end on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. So we have 3 minutes for questions. If you could please wait until the microphone arrives, because the questions will be recorded along with Neil's answers. So if you could raise your hand if you do have a question, please, and wait for the microphone to arrive. Are there any questions? Yes, the gentleman here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You talked about some of the challenges of getting the right veterinary advice and interactions with the farmers so that they can apply appropriate pragmatic solutions. Your final suggestion, which I think is a really good one, appears to present an even greater challenge of marrying a slightly higher level of technology, albeit one that's becoming more available, with on-the-ground situation for farmers, their stock and their parasite resistance. Do you have any thoughts about how to bring those two elements together to achieve the result you're suggesting?
Yes. The first thing is that the people that are involved with that high-end research have to start speaking to the likes of ourselves who are involved at the animal end of things and actually have to understand what the findings of that research actually mean in the field. At the same time, the veterinary profession actually has to up its game as well, and the veterinary profession has to start looking more towards what is this research actually capable of doing, and driving some of the agenda from that research to ensure that these platforms that we've got, which are going to provide all the solutions, I'm quite convinced of that, are going to provide the solutions to the problems that we actually need. And then the other thing that has to go with that is we have to have education, and we have to have education that's able to sort of bring everything together. So no one person can do all that. Yeah.
Any more questions from the floor? A gentleman at the back on the left-hand side.
Your vision of how to control the situation is very admirable, but when you take into context the economic reality of management of farmers globally, so the governmental interference in the sustenance or the maintenance of, for example, crofter farmers in Scotland, that skews the whole economics of what your view of how to manage the situation is. How can you tie that in with what you've just said about the balance between, practitioners on the ground and the theory of what you're presenting there?
Yeah, I can only agree with what you just said, and that's why I prefaced the comments I made about animal health planning with the fact that actually it's not going to have any impact at all without first addressing some of those political issues and actually making sure that there is access to equitable markets, in particular that there's all the logistics and infrastructure that's needed in order to get to those markets. Because until we reach that stage, there's no impetus whatsoever to improve. I've seen that in Malawi, where some of those images were taken, where people are so poor that the only it takes away the impetus to improve, because they can't invest in improvement because they're so poor. They would just put that investment straight into themselves, and they can't see the longer future. And actually, they'd say, well, what's the point if we still can't get a good price for our animals? And I'm afraid that subsidy-driven agriculture in this part of the world has, in my opinion, been disastrous in terms of production efficiency, because certainly the farmers I work with, I see them far more interested in chasing subsidy payments and how they manage the subsidy payments than they are necessarily in investing in animal health. And that's despite the fact that they know what some of these diseases are actually costing them.
Great. Thank you very much, Neil. We do have to stick strictly to time. So thank you very much, Neil, for an excellent start to our session. Our next